January 12, 1948. A wrecking ball swung through the cold morning air on Riverside Drive in Manhattan and struck limestone. The target was the Schwab Mansion, a 75-room palace that had cost $7 million to build 40 years earlier. Charles Schwab's widow had tried desperately to sell it, but no buyer would pay even the annual property taxes. The mansion that required 4 years and 2,000 workers to construct came down in 6 weeks. Its marble fireplaces were shipped to a Florida hotel, its bronze fixtures melted for scrap, its carved oak paneling sold by the pound. This is the story of why America systematically demolished hundreds of its greatest architectural achievements, tearing down palaces built to last forever, because the fortunes that created them couldn't sustain them. The destruction began on Fifth Avenue and spread outward like a contagion. By 1900, Manhattan's most famous street had become a canyon of private palaces, stretching from Washington Square to the edge of Central Park. The Vanderbilts alone owned 7 mansions along this single corridor. The Astors occupied an entire block. The Whitneys, the Huntingtons, the Fricks, and the Goulds had all staked their claims in stone and marble. Visitors from Europe marveled at the concentration of wealth. Nothing in London or Paris could match it. Millionaire's Row, they called it. Within 60 years, almost every one of those palaces would be gone. The numbers are staggering even now. In 1900, Fifth Avenue between 50th and 90th Streets contained more than 40 major private residences, each worth millions. By 1960, fewer than 5 remained standing. The rest had been demolished, their lots cleared for apartment buildings, office towers, and commercial developments. The William K. Vanderbilt Mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue, completed in 1882 at a cost of $3 million, was torn down in 1926. The Senator William Clark Mansion at 962 Fifth Avenue, all 121 rooms of it, fell in 1927. The Charles Yerkes Mansion went in 1938. The Schwab Mansion on Riverside Drive, perhaps the grandest private home ever built in Manhattan, was demolished in 1948. Each demolition erased years of construction and millions of dollars of investment in a matter of weeks. Newport suffered the same fate on a compressed geographic scale. The summer colony that had once boasted over 80 major cottages lost more than half of them between 1920 and 1970. Beacon Hill House was demolished in 1939. Hope Dean fell in 1938. Land's End, the Gothic revival masterpiece where Edith Wharton had summered as a guest, was torn down in 1963. The Drexel Cottage vanished. The Gamble House disappeared. Property after property was erased from the landscape, replaced by subdivisions or vacant lots, or developments that bore no relationship to what had stood before. The wrecking crews moved through Bellevue Avenue with business-like efficiency, dismantling in days what had taken years to perfect. Chicago's Prairie Avenue tells the same story with different names and different architectural styles. In 1880, this stretch of the South Side was home to more millionaires per square foot than any other street in America. The Pullmans lived there in a massive stone mansion. So did the Armours, the meatpacking kings. The Fields built there. The Kimballs constructed an elaborate chateau. Their mansions were smaller than Newport cottages, but no less elaborate inside, filled with European furniture and staffed by dozens of servants. By 1950, Prairie Avenue had become an industrial wasteland surrounded by rail yards. The Glessner House survived only because its Romanesque stone walls proved too expensive to demolish profitably. The Kimball Mansion became a warehouse before eventually falling. Most of the others simply disappeared, without ceremony. Philadelphia lost Rittenhouse Square's great houses one by one through the same decades. Boston watched Beacon Hill's largest mansions subdivided into apartments, or demolished for institutional buildings. San Francisco's Nob Hill palaces burned in the 1906 earthquake and fire. The families who had built them chose not to rebuild as private homes. The Hopkins Mansion became the Mark Hopkins Hotel. The Stanford Mansion was donated to become a school. The Crocker Mansion was never reconstructed at all. Across America, from coast to coast, the pattern repeated itself with depressing consistency. The greatest private residences ever constructed in the New World were systematically destroyed within a single generation of their completion. The salvage operations became an industry unto themselves, employing specialists who stripped these mansions before the wrecking balls arrived. When the Clark Mansion came down, dealers moved through it first like archaeologists. The marble fireplaces went to collectors in Palm Beach. The bronze fixtures were cataloged and melted for their metal value. The carved woodwork was dismantled panel by panel and shipped to buyers across the country. Some pieces ended up in museums as examples of Gilded Age craftsmanship. Others disappeared into private collections and were never seen publicly again. A significant portion was simply destroyed on site, too expensive to remove carefully, too elaborate to find buyers willing to pay transport costs. The Schwab Mansion's gymnasium equipment went to a local school. Its massive pipe organ was donated to a church in need. Everything else became rubble hauled to landfills. What replaced these palaces tells its own story of changing values. The Vanderbilt Mansion at First and West 57th Street became the Bergdorf Goodman department store, serving thousands of customers daily where one family had lived. The Astor Mansion site contributed to the Empire State Building's construction. Senator Clark's 121-room palace was demolished to make way for an apartment building containing 39 units for 39 families. The lots that had held single wealthy households now housed hundreds of middle-class residents. The exclusivity that the original owners had prized above all other qualities was erased completely and deliberately. The speed of destruction accelerated dramatically after 1929. The stock market crash didn't just impoverish the families who owned these mansions. It destroyed the entire economic logic that had made them possible to maintain. Before the crash, wealthy families had kept these properties as statements of permanent dynasty. After the crash, the mansions became unsaleable liabilities dragging down entire estates. No one wanted to buy a 75-room palace that cost $200,000 a year to operate. No one could afford to, even if they wanted. The math had changed permanently and irreversibly. By 1940, mansion demolitions had become so common that they barely made newspapers. Another palace coming down. Another piece of American architectural history erased from the urban landscape. The newspapers covered only the largest and most famous ones. The Schwab Mansion warranted front-page treatment. So did the Clark Mansion and the major Vanderbilt properties. But dozens of smaller palaces vanished without public comment or preservation efforts. They had been built to announce their owner's arrival at the summit of American society. They were destroyed because that summit no longer existed as a destination anyone could reach. The question that lingered over every demolition was always the same. Why couldn't these families save their own houses? These were still wealthy people by any normal standard of measurement. The Vanderbilts hadn't become poor in any meaningful sense. The Astors retained enormous fortunes spread across multiple generations. The grandchildren of the original mansion builders often possessed more money in absolute dollar terms than their grandparents had commanded. Yet they couldn't keep a single house standing without extraordinary measures. They chose demolition over preservation. They chose destruction over the burden of maintenance. Something in the fundamental equation had changed permanently. The mansions were built for a world that vanished beneath their owners' feet. That was the simplest answer anyone could give. The federal income tax hadn't existed when Cornelius Vanderbilt II commissioned his Fifth Avenue Palace in the 1880s. Servants had cost almost nothing compared to later decades. Property taxes had been nominal fractions of assessed value. The wealth required to build these structures and the wealth required to maintain them had seemed identical to the men who signed the construction contracts. They weren't identical at all. Building required capital. a one-time expenditure, however large. Maintenance required income year after year without end. The distinction between these two kinds of money would prove fatal to nearly every mansion built during the Gilded Age. To understand why these palaces fell so quickly after rising so magnificently, we have to understand why they rose in the first place. The men who built them weren't simply rich by the standards of their time. They were the richest Americans who had ever lived up to that point, commanding fortunes that dwarfed anything the young country had seen before. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan, Frick. These names represented concentrations of wealth that rivaled European royalty, and they faced a problem that no amount of money could solve by writing checks. They needed to prove they belonged among the elite. They needed to establish that their families mattered. They needed credentials that couldn't be bought directly, but had to be constructed, literally, in stone. The Gilded Age began in the wreckage of the Civil War and exploded into something America had never seen. Between 1865 and 1900, the country industrialized with breathtaking speed. Railroads connected coasts. Steel mills transformed cities. Oil refineries created fortunes overnight. The men who controlled these industries accumulated wealth on a scale that dwarfed European aristocracy. John D. Rockefeller's net worth peaked at nearly $1 billion in an era when the entire federal budget was $525 million. Andrew Carnegie sold his steel empire for $480 million in 1901. Cornelius Vanderbilt left $100 million when he died in 1877. His son doubled it within 8 years. These weren't just rich men, they were richer than anyone in American history had ever been. But wealth alone meant nothing in the social hierarchy of the 1870s. The old families of New York, the Astors and Livingstons and Schuylers, looked down on the new industrial fortunes with unconcealed contempt. Money earned from railroads smelled of coal smoke. Money from steel carried the stench of immigrant labor. Money from oil was simply vulgar. The established aristocracy had inherited their positions through generations of respectable mercantile trade. They weren't about to welcome men whose grandfathers had been farmers into their drawing rooms. The gatekeepers enforced their boundaries ruthlessly. Mrs. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, married to the grandson of John Jacob Astor, appointed herself the arbiter of New York society. With her social advisor, Ward McAllister, she compiled a list of acceptable families. The number was 400, supposedly because that was how many guests could fit comfortably in her ballroom. Anyone not on the list simply didn't exist socially. Invitations to her annual ball determined who mattered and who didn't. New money was explicitly excluded. The Vanderbilts weren't invited, neither were the Rockefellers or the Carnegies. They had more money than Mrs. Astor could count. It made no difference. The new industrialists faced an impossible situation. They had conquered every economic challenge America could offer. They had built railroads across continents. They had created monopolies in steel and oil and finance. They had bent markets to their will and crushed competitors without mercy. But they couldn't buy their way past Mrs. Astor's ballroom door. Their daughters couldn't marry into respectable families. Their sons were blackballed from the right clubs. All that money, and they remained social outsiders in their own city. The solution emerged gradually, then became an arms race. If old money wouldn't accept them based on lineage, new money would force acceptance through overwhelming display. They would build houses so magnificent that society couldn't ignore them. They would import European culture wholesale and demonstrate refinement that exceeded anything the old families possessed. They would create facts on the ground in limestone and marble that made their social position undeniable. Alva Erskine Smith understood this strategy better than anyone. She had married William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1875, connecting herself to the greatest railroad fortune in America. But the Vanderbilt name still carried the taint of old Cornelius, the Commodore, who had sworn and spat and cheated his way to wealth. Alva intended to change that perception permanently. In 1879, she commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to design a mansion at 1660 Fifth Avenue. Hunt had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He understood how European aristocracy announced itself through architecture. The result was a French Renaissance chateau transplanted to Manhattan, complete with limestone facade and elaborate carved details. The house cost $3 million to build. It was worth every penny as social artillery. The mansion opened with a costume ball in March 1883. 1,200 guests attended. The decorations alone cost $155,000. Alva dressed as a Venetian princess. Her sister-in-law wore a gown covered in real electric lights powered by hidden batteries. The party lasted until 6 in the morning. Mrs. Astor attended. That was the point. Alva had maneuvered the old guard into acknowledging her existence by making her party the only event worth attending that season. The mansion had forced open the door that money alone couldn't budge. The lesson was not lost on the other new money families. If one chateau could breach society's walls, imagine what a dozen could do. The building campaign accelerated immediately. William K. Vanderbilt's brother Cornelius II commissioned an even larger mansion at Fern West 57th Street. The Astors responded with expansions of their own. The Whitneys built, the Huntingtons built, the Goulds built. Each family tried to outdo the others in scale and magnificence. The competition fed on itself, driving costs higher and designs more elaborate with each passing year. Newport became the summer theater for this architectural warfare. The Rhode Island resort had been fashionable since before the Civil War, but the new money families transformed it completely. They bought oceanfront lots along Bellevue Avenue and Ochre Point. They commissioned summer cottages that dwarfed the permanent residences of European nobles. Marble House cost William K. Vanderbilt $11 million in 1892. The Breakers cost his brother Cornelius $7 million in 1895. Rosecliff cost Herman Ulrichs $2.5 million. Rough Point cost Frederick Vanderbilt over $1 million. These weren't homes in any conventional sense. They were fortifications in a social war, built to establish dominance through sheer, overwhelming presence. The philosophy driving these constructions was explicit and unapologetic. Wealth should be visible. Modesty was for people who couldn't afford excess. The point wasn't comfort or even beauty, though beauty often resulted. The point was proving that you could spend more than anyone else on a house you would occupy 8 weeks a year. The more impractical the display, the more powerful the statement. Anyone could build a house they needed. Only the truly wealthy could build monuments to their own superfluity. This philosophy had consequences the builders never anticipated. They were constructing structures that required their level of wealth to maintain. A 70-room palace needed 50 servants. A marble facade needed constant cleaning. Elaborate mechanical systems needed specialized engineers. The annual operating costs rivaled the purchase price of an ordinary mansion. But the Vanderbilts and Astors and Whitneys didn't think in terms of operating costs. They thought in terms of competitive positioning. They were fighting a war, and wars are expensive. The European imports accelerated the arms race further. Alva Vanderbilt had started by bringing in a French-trained architect. Others went further. They bought entire rooms from European chateaux and shipped them across the Atlantic. They purchased tapestries from cathedrals and paintings from noble collections. They hired French craftsmen to build interiors in Paris, then disassembled them and reconstructed them in Newport. William Randolph Hearst would later spend decades buying European castles piece by piece. The Gilded Age families established the template. American wealth could buy European culture wholesale. The marriages followed the same logic of acquisition. If you couldn't inherit aristocratic blood, you could purchase it through marriage. American heiresses began crossing the Atlantic in search of titled husbands. Consuelo Vanderbilt married the Duke of Marlborough in 1895. Her dowry was $2.5 million in railroad stock plus a $100,000 annual income. The Duke got money to restore Blenheim Palace. The Vanderbilts got a duchess in the family. Similar transactions occurred by the dozens. American fortunes bought British titles, French chateaux, Italian palazzos. The new aristocracy was constructing itself piece by piece. By 1900, the social war was essentially won. Mrs. Astor's list had expanded to include the Vanderbilts and other new money families. The distinctions between old and new fortunes had blurred into irrelevance. The mansions along Fifth Avenue and Bellevue Avenue represented the absolute pinnacle of American wealth and taste. Nothing in Europe could match them for concentrated magnificence. The families who built them had achieved everything they sought. They had proven their supremacy in the only language American society understood: overwhelming, undeniable display. But they had built on assumptions that were already crumbling. The federal government would soon assert powers it had never exercised. The Income Tax Amendment was ratified in 1913. The social consensus that celebrated visible wealth was shifting. The servants who staffed these palaces were organizing unions. The fortunes that seemed infinite were about to be divided among heirs who would divide them further. The men who built these monuments believed they were establishing permanent dynasties. They were actually building their own obsolescence in stone. The Vanderbilts built more than any other family. They had more money to spend and more points to prove. Old Cornelius, the Commodore, had died in 1877, leaving $100 million and a reputation for crudeness that embarrassed his descendants. His son William Henry doubled the fortune, but couldn't shake the family's Arivista status. The grandchildren inherited both the money and the problem. They solved it through construction on a scale America had never witnessed. Cornelius Vanderbilt II took up the burden of being the responsible heir. He inherited the largest share of William Henry's estate in 1885, approximately $70 million, plus control of the New York Central Railroad. His younger brothers received smaller portions and fewer obligations. Cornelius got the weight of the family name. He approached the responsibility with grim determination. Friends later remarked that he never seemed happy. The mansion building was duty, not pleasure. His Fifth Avenue residence at Warren West 57th Street became the largest private home in Manhattan history. The original structure, designed by George Post, wasn't sufficient. Cornelius commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to expand it repeatedly through the 1890s. The final version contained over 130 rooms spread across an entire city block. The Great Hall rose 3 stories. The art gallery held paintings worth millions. The service areas employed dozens of servants who lived in quarters behind the main house. The cost exceeded $5 million, not counting furnishings and artwork. Cornelius maintained it as headquarters for the family's social operations, while spending most of his time at railroad offices downtown. His brother William Kissam took a different approach. William K. had married Alva, the ambitious woman who understood that mansions were weapons. Together, they commissioned the chateau at 660 Fifth Avenue that broke society's barriers in 1883. But Alva wasn't satisfied with one victory. She wanted Newport conquered too. Marble House became her summer campaign headquarters. The design drew directly on the Petit Trianon at Versailles. The exterior was white marble, the interior was gold. The Chinese tea house in the grounds cost $100,000 alone. Total expenditure reached $11 million by 1892. When the house was complete, Alva reportedly told William she wanted nothing more to do with him. They divorced in 1895. She kept the house. The youngest brother, George Washington Vanderbilt, built on the grandest scale of all, though not in New York or Newport. George was scholarly and introverted, more interested in books than society. He chose to construct his monument in the mountains of North Carolina, far from the competitive arena his brothers inhabited. Biltmore Estate would be the largest private home in America. 178,926 square feet of French Renaissance chateau surrounded by 125,000 acres of managed forest. Richard Morris Hunt designed it. Frederick Law Olmsted landscaped the grounds. Construction began in 1889 and continued for 6 years. The house contained 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and 65 fireplaces. George spent approximately $5 million on construction and millions more on furnishings. He filled the library with 10,000 volumes. He imported tapestries and paintings and furniture from European auctions. The result was magnificent and utterly impractical. George would spend most of his life trying to make the estate financially sustainable. The Astor family responded to the Vanderbilt building campaign with expansions of their own. Caroline Astor's house on 34th Street had defined society for decades, but it was looking dated by the 1890s. Her son, John Jacob Astor IV, commissioned a new double mansion on Fifth Avenue at 65th Street. The structure would house both his mother and his own family in connected but separate wings. The design by Richard Morris Hunt combined French Renaissance elements with the latest technologies. Mrs. Astor's ballroom could now accommodate far more than 400 guests. The message was clear. The Astors would not be outbuilt by railroad money. Charles Schwab represented a different kind of builder entirely. He had started as a laborer in Andrew Carnegie's steel mills and risen through ability and charm to become president of U.S. Steel. When Carnegie sold his empire in 1901, Schwab received millions in stock and bonuses. He decided to build the greatest private residence New York had ever seen. The site he chose was not Fifth Avenue, but Riverside Drive, where he could have an entire city block. The architect was Maurice Hébert. The style was French Renaissance. The scale was staggering. The house contained 75 rooms plus a gymnasium, bowling alley, swimming pool, and private power plant. Construction cost over $7 million. Schwab moved in around 1906 and entertained lavishly for years. He reportedly never locked his doors, believing that anyone who wanted to see how a steel magnate lived should be welcome. The competitive dynamic drove ever more elaborate constructions. The Whitneys built on Fifth Avenue, then in Long Island, then in multiple locations simultaneously. The Goulds constructed mansions across several states. The Fricks built one of the finest small palaces in New York, designed by Thomas Hastings with interiors that would later become the Frick Collection Museum. Henry Clay Frick had made his fortune in coke and steel, serving as Carnegie's partner and enforcer during the brutal Homestead Strike of 1892. His mansion was smaller than the Vanderbilt palaces, but more refined, every room a gallery for his art collection. The architects who served these families became celebrities in their own right. Richard Morris Hunt dominated the field until his death in 1895. He had designed the Vanderbilt Chateau at 1660 Fifth Avenue, the expansion of Cornelius II's mansion, Marble House, the Breakers, Biltmore Estate, and the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. His Beaux Arts training shaped American architecture for decades. When he died, still supervising the Breakers' final details, his son took over the practice. The firm of McKim, Mead, and White competed for commissions, designing the Whitney Mansion and numerous other society residences. Stanford White became as famous as his clients, his personal life scandalized, and his professional output extraordinary. The building never really stopped through the 1890s and into the new century. Each family that achieved great wealth felt compelled to announce it through construction. The mansions multiplied along Fifth Avenue, along Newport's Bellevue Avenue, along Philadelphia's Main Line and Chicago's Prairie Avenue. Every city with millionaires soon had a mansion district where the wealthy competed through architecture. The style was usually some variant of European classicism, whether French Chateau, Italian Renaissance, or English Tudor. The message was consistent. American wealth could buy anything European aristocracy possessed, and buy more of it. But something strange was happening beneath the surface of all this building. The men commissioning these palaces weren't enjoying them. Cornelius Vanderbilt II worked constantly and died at 55 after a stroke left him partially paralyzed for 3 years. William K. Vanderbilt's marriage collapsed under the pressure of social climbing. Charles Schwab would later confess that his mansion brought him no happiness, that he would have been content in a smaller house with less to maintain. The palaces were obligations, not pleasures. They required constant attention and bottomless expenditure. They were built to prove something, and once proven, they became burdens. George Vanderbilt perhaps understood this best. He spent years at Biltmore trying to make the estate pay for itself through scientific forestry and agriculture. The forests eventually turned modest profits. The house itself never did. It consumed money faster than his investments could generate it. When George died in 1914 from complications after an appendectomy, his widow Edith faced the same impossible arithmetic that would eventually confront every mansion owner. The house was beautiful. It was also a financial drain that never stopped flowing. The pattern was set. Build magnificently. Prove your worth. Then discover that what you built requires your entire fortune to maintain. The trap was invisible while the fortunes held. It would become inescapable when they didn't. The construction of these palaces required logistics that rivaled military campaigns. When Cornelius Vanderbilt II decided to rebuild the breakers after fire destroyed the original wooden cottage in 1892, he gave Richard Morris Hunt an impossible deadline. Design an Italian Renaissance palace. Make it completely fireproof. Finish in time for the summer season of 1895. 2 years for a project that should have taken 5. Hunt delivered, but only by mobilizing resources on an unprecedented scale. The foundation work began in spring of 1893. Workers excavated deep into the rocky Newport Cliff, creating a base that could support hundreds of tons of limestone and steel. The excavation alone took months. The bedrock was uneven and required blasting in places. Every cubic yard of removed stone had to be hauled away by horse and wagon. The site became a small city of workers living in temporary housing nearby. Records suggest that at peak construction, over 2,000 men labored on the property in rotating shifts around the clock. The materials came from around the world. The limestone for the exterior walls was quarried in Indiana, cut into massive blocks, and shipped by rail to Newport. Italian stonemasons traveled from Europe to carve the elaborate decorative elements. The marble for the interior floors and columns came from quarries in Italy and Africa, each piece selected for color and quality. Bronze fixtures were cast in France. Crystal for the chandeliers came from Baccarat. Rare woods for paneling were sourced from forests across multiple continents. The logistics of coordinating these shipments while maintaining the construction schedule required full-time managers working constantly. The fireproof requirement drove every structural decision. The original breakers had been a wooden Queen Anne cottage that burned in hours. The new structure would use no wood in its frame at all. The skeleton was steel, revolutionary for residential construction at the time. The walls were masonry faced with limestone. Even the roof trusses were steel rather than timber. The boilers that heated the building were housed in an underground chamber beneath the front lawn, connected to the house by tunnel. If they exploded, the main structure would survive. Hunt had solved the fire problem by eliminating everything that could burn. The music room demonstrated the extremes these families would pursue. Cornelius wanted a room worthy of formal concerts and recitals. Hunt designed it, but the actual construction happened in France. The firm of Allard et Fels built the entire room in their Paris workshops, carving every panel and molding to exact specifications. When complete, workers disassembled the room piece by piece. Each element was numbered and packed for transatlantic shipping. French craftsmen then traveled to Newport to reassemble everything inside the steel frame Hunt had prepared. The walls weren't covered in gold leaf as many assumed. They were covered in platinum, which Alice Vanderbilt preferred for its subtler sheen. The cost of platinum alone was staggering. This pattern of building abroad and shipping to America became standard practice. William K. Vanderbilt's marble house contained a Gothic room built entirely in France and transplanted to Newport. The Elms, built for coal magnate Edward Berwind, featured interiors created in Paris by Allard et Fils and shipped across the Atlantic. Rosecliffe's ballroom was modeled on Versailles and executed by French craftsmen working on American soil. The families didn't trust American artisans to achieve European levels of refinement. They imported the craftsmen along with the materials. The Schwab Mansion in New York presented different logistical challenges. The site on Riverside Drive covered an entire city block. The foundation had to be excavated through Manhattan bedrock while maintaining the stability of surrounding streets. The steel frame rose story by story through 1904 and 1905. The exterior was granite and limestone. The interior contained innovations that pushed the boundaries of residential technology. The swimming pool was one of the first in a private Manhattan home. The gymnasium included the latest exercise equipment. A power plant in the basement generated electricity for the entire structure independently of the city grid. Schwab could host hundreds of guests while the house ran on its own power supply. The attention to mechanical systems reflected the era's technological optimism. The breakers featured both gas and electric lighting, with switches to convert between them if one system failed. The bathrooms had 4 faucets each, delivering hot and cold fresh water plus hot and cold seawater pumped from the Atlantic and heated in rooftop tanks. Central heating systems required enormous coal-fired boilers that consumed fuel constantly during winter months. Ventilation systems moved air through the buildings using fans powered by steam or electricity. These systems were marvels of engineering, but they also required specialized knowledge to maintain. Every improvement added another layer of complexity and expense. The time required for construction varied enormously depending on ambition. Marble House took 4 years to complete, from 1888 to 1892. The breakers rose in roughly 2.5 years under Hunt's forced schedule. Biltmore required 6 years, from 1889 to 1895, and even then, George Vanderbilt continued adding to the grounds and outbuildings for years afterward. The Clark Mansion on Fifth Avenue took 3 years. Smaller mansions could be finished in 18 months to 2 years. Larger projects stretched indefinitely as owners demanded changes and additions. The workforce that built these mansions represented a cross-section of the era's labor force. Skilled European craftsmen commanded high wages and were treated with relative respect. Italian stonemasons, French woodcarvers, and German metalworkers brought techniques that American workers hadn't yet mastered. Below them worked layers of less skilled laborers, many of them recent immigrants earning modest daily wages for physically demanding work. The construction sites were dangerous. Falls were common. Equipment failures caused injuries. No safety regulations existed in any modern sense. The mansions rose on the backs of workers whose names were never recorded in the final accounts. The cost accounting for these projects revealed the priorities of their owners. Construction costs typically represented only the beginning. The breakers cost approximately $7 million to build, but furnishing and decorating added millions more. Marble House's construction cost of $11 million included both structure and interiors, but Alva Vanderbilt spent additional fortunes on the grounds and the Chinese tea house. Biltmore's $5 million construction cost was dwarfed by the expense of landscaping 125,000 acres and filling 250 rooms with furniture and art. The houses were shells. What went inside them doubled or tripled the investment. When the construction ended and the decorators departed, the families moved in to discover what they had created. The rooms were magnificent. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The technology represented the cutting edge of comfort and convenience. But the houses also revealed their demands immediately. The heating systems needed constant feeding. The armies of servants required management. The grounds needed maintenance. The beautiful things needed cleaning and preservation. The mansions were not just possessions, they were obligations that began the moment the last worker left and continued without pause until the buildings were demolished or given away. The men who commissioned these structures understood construction. They had built railroads and steel mills and oil refineries. They knew how to create things at scale. What they didn't fully grasp was the difference between building something once and maintaining it forever. A railroad generates revenue that pays for its upkeep. A mansion generates nothing. It only consumes year after year, demanding tribute from the fortune that created it. The construction was finished. The costs had just begun. Walk through the front door of the breakers, and the first thing you see is the Great Hall, rising nearly 50 feet to a painted ceiling, designed to resemble an open Italian sky. Massive columns line the walls, their capitals gilded and elaborate. The floor is polished marble in geometric patterns. A grand staircase curves upward to the second-floor gallery, its balustrades carved from rare stone. The space was designed to overwhelm visitors before they saw anything else. It succeeded completely. The scale of these entrance halls was deliberate psychological warfare. The Clark Mansion's entrance rose 3 stories, with a skylight flooding the space with natural light. The Schwab Mansion's foyer featured marble walls and bronze fixtures that cost more than entire houses in ordinary neighborhoods. The Frick residence opened into a courtyard atrium with a fountain and garden visible through glass walls. Each family wanted visitors to understand immediately that they had entered a different world, one where normal constraints didn't apply. The Breakers' music room demonstrated what unlimited budgets could achieve. The walls were covered in platinum rather than gold because Alice Vanderbilt preferred the subtler color. The ceiling was elaborately carved and gilded. The chandeliers were baccarat crystal, weighing hundreds of pounds each. The room could accommodate over 100 guests for recitals and concerts. During Newport's social season, the finest musicians in America performed here for audiences dressed in clothes that cost thousands of dollars. The room, built in France and shipped across the Atlantic, was worth the journey. The dining rooms in these mansions could seat dozens for formal meals that lasted hours. The Breakers' dining room rose 2 stories high, surrounded by 12 columns of Algerian marble with gilded bronze capitals. The ceiling was coffered and painted. 2 enormous baccarat chandeliers hung above the table, each containing thousands of crystal pieces. The fireplace at one end was large enough to stand inside, carved from multiple types of marble in contrasting colors. 34 guests could dine here simultaneously, while servants moved through hidden doors built into the walls. The kitchens that supported these dining rooms were industrial operations. The Breakers' kitchen contained multiple cooking ranges, preparation areas for different types of food, ice boxes that required daily deliveries, and storage rooms for the vast quantities of ingredients required. A hierarchy of cooks worked under a chef who commanded wages exceeding those of many professionals. The food traveled through service corridors and dumbwaiters to arrive at the dining room hot and perfectly presented. Guests never saw the machinery behind the performance. The private quarters revealed different priorities. Alice Vanderbilt's bedroom at the Breakers was an oval room designed by Ogden Codman with 4 closets to accommodate the 7 costume changes she made each day during the social season. Her morning outfit differed from her afternoon dress, which differed from her evening gown, which differed from her formal dinner attire. Each change required different accessories and jewelry. The closets held dozens of outfits with hundreds of matching items. A paging system by her bed summoned servants from anywhere in the house. The bathrooms in these mansions featured innovations that wouldn't become standard for decades. The breakers' bathrooms had 4 faucets, hot and cold fresh water, plus hot and cold seawater pumped from the Atlantic and stored in rooftop tanks. Saltwater baths were considered therapeutic. The fixtures were carved from marble or cast in bronze. Alice's bathtub was cut from a single block of marble weighing over a ton. Getting it into the house and up to the second floor required special engineering. The plumbing alone cost more than ordinary families spent on entire homes. The libraries in these houses contained thousands of volumes, often purchased by the yard rather than by title. George Vanderbilt at Biltmore was a genuine bibliophile who read multiple languages and accumulated over 23,000 books he actually intended to study. The Breakers' library was paneled in Circassian walnut, impressed with gold leaf, in patterns resembling leather-bound books. The fireplace mantel came from a 16th-century French chateau. Above it was carved an inscription in French, "I laugh at great wealth and never miss it. Nothing but wisdom matters in the end." The irony of that message appearing in a $7 million palace apparently escaped everyone involved. The art on these walls represented fortunes spent in European auction houses. The Frick collection, now a public museum, shows what Henry Clay Frick accumulated: Vermeers, Rembrandts, El Gricos, Turners, works by dozens of masters. The Vanderbilts collected differently, favoring decorative arts and furnishings over paintings. The Astors assembled tapestries and sculptures. Each family's collection reflected their particular idea of what culture meant and how wealth should be displayed. The art wasn't just beautiful, it was evidence of sophistication that money alone couldn't guarantee. The grounds surrounding these mansions extended the architectural statements outdoors. The Breakers sat on 13 acres, with formal gardens, fountains, and paths leading to the cliff edge where the Atlantic crashed against the rocks. Marble House featured elaborate gardens with the Chinese tea house that Alva Vanderbilt used for her suffrage meetings after she remarried. Biltmore's grounds, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, covered 125,000 acres of managed forest, gardens, and agricultural land. The scale was staggering. Maintaining these grounds required armies of gardeners working year-round. The servant quarters occupied entire floors, hidden from family and guest areas. The Breakers housed 33 servants in rooms on the 4th floor, under the mansard roof. These were comfortable by contemporary standards, each with a bed, dresser, and window, but they were also separate from the world below. Hidden corridors allowed female servants to move through the house without being seen. The family could pretend their comforts appeared by magic while dozens of workers labored invisibly to create that illusion. The entertainments hosted in these rooms defined the Gilded Age social calendar. Alva Vanderbilt's costume ball of 1883 became legendary, with guests spending thousands on their outfits. Mrs. Astor's annual ball determined social standing for the entire season. The parties at Newport during the summer rivaled anything European aristocracy could offer. Orchestras played, elaborate foods were served, fireworks lit the sky. Guests arrived in carriages, later in automobiles, wearing jewels worth more than factories. The mansions existed for these moments, built as stages for performances of wealth. The ironies embedded in these structures were invisible to their creators. They built rooms to prove their culture while buying art by the shipload. They constructed libraries filled with unread books. They carved mottos about wisdom into walls that celebrated nothing but excess. The mansions were statements about permanence, made by families whose fortunes were already beginning to fragment. Every elaborate room was also a maintenance burden. Every gilded ceiling needed periodic restoration. Every marble floor required specialized cleaning. The beauty came with a price tag that never stopped accumulating. The families had built monuments to their own supremacy. They had also built monuments to the impossibility of maintaining supremacy forever. The breakers cost $83,000 a year in property taxes alone. The family used it 8 weeks annually. That single number reveals the fatal flaw embedded in every Gilded Age mansion. These buildings were designed to demonstrate wealth, not to be efficient or practical. The more impractical the display, the more powerful the statement. But impracticality has a price tag that arrives every year without fail. The seasonal pattern defined Newport from the beginning. The summer colony existed from early June through late August, perhaps 12 weeks at most. Many families stayed even shorter periods, arriving in July and departing before Labor Day. The Vanderbilts typically occupied the breakers for 8 weeks, sometimes less if business called them back to New York. During those 8 weeks, the house ran at full capacity. Dozens of servants worked around the clock. The kitchens prepared elaborate meals. The grounds were manicured to perfection. Parties filled the music room. Then September arrived and almost everyone left. The mansions didn't close completely during the off-season. Caretaker couples remained year-round, living in the vast, empty structures and walking through dozens of unused rooms periodically. Their job was to prevent disaster, not to maintain luxury. They checked for leaks and broken windows. They ensured the heating systems ran enough to prevent pipes from freezing. They watched for signs of deterioration and reported problems that required attention. The houses sat dormant for 44 weeks each year, monuments waiting for their brief annual occupancy. The heating systems alone consumed staggering quantities of fuel. The breakers' boilers burned over 150 tons of coal annually, most of it during the off-season when the family wasn't even present. The coal had to be delivered, stored, and fed into furnaces that required constant tending. The staff who managed these systems needed salaries year-round. The mechanical complexity meant that breakdowns were common and expensive. Every mansion of this scale faced similar demands. The furnaces never stopped, and neither did the costs. The staffing requirements scaled with the ambition of the architecture. A modest, wealthy household in 1890 might employ 5 or 6 servants. A Gilded Age mansion required 50 or more during the season. The breakers needed 58 staff members to operate properly when the family was in residence. Cooks, maids, footmen, butlers, gardeners, coachmen, laundresses, and specialized workers each had specific roles in an elaborate hierarchy. During the off-season, most were dismissed, but a core staff remained on salary to maintain the property. The payroll never stopped completely. The grounds demanded attention regardless of whether anyone was enjoying them. Formal gardens required expert gardeners working throughout the growing season. Lawns needed mowing, hedges needed trimming, trees needed pruning. The paths and drives needed maintenance. In winter, snow had to be cleared and damage from storms repaired. A 13-acre estate like the Breakers employed a permanent grounds crew whose salaries added up quickly. Larger properties like Biltmore's 125,000 acres required entire departments of forestry and agricultural workers. The philosophy behind this waste was explicit and unapologetic. Wealthy families weren't embarrassed by maintaining houses they barely used. That was exactly the point. Anyone could buy a house they needed and lived in year-round. Only the truly rich could maintain palaces that sat empty most of the time. The waste demonstrated surplus. It proved that the family had so much money they could afford to spend hundreds of thousands annually on properties they occupied for a few summer weeks. The more impractical, the more impressive. This philosophy worked perfectly as long as fortunes remained stable and enormous. Cornelius Vanderbilt II inherited approximately $70 million in 1885. At conservative investment returns, that fortune generated millions in annual income without touching the principal. Spending $500,000 a year on multiple mansions left plenty for everything else. The math seemed bulletproof. The fortune was essentially infinite. The costs, however large, could never exhaust it. But fortunes don't remain concentrated forever. The Vanderbilt wealth peaked with William Henry's $200 million estate in 1885. He divided it among his children. Cornelius II received the largest share, but his brothers and sisters received substantial inheritances too. When each of them died, their estates were divided again among their children. Every generation diluted the fortune further. Every generation also spent more freely than the one before, building bigger houses and maintaining more elaborate lifestyles. The distinction between a fortune and an inheritance became critical. A fortune generates income that exceeds expenses. You can spend lavishly and still grow richer each year. An inheritance is a fixed sum that depletes as you spend it. You can live well for a time, but eventually the money runs out. The men who built the Gilded Age mansions possessed fortunes. Their grandchildren inherited what remained after division and spending. The difference was invisible at first, but ultimately fatal. The property tax burden grew heavier each decade. The mansions had been built when property taxes were nearly negligible. By the 1920s, local governments had discovered that taxing these palaces generated substantial revenue. The breakers' $83,000 annual tax bill would be the equivalent of well over $1 million today. That was just one property. Families who owned mansions in multiple locations faced combined tax burdens that consumed enormous portions of their declining incomes. The economics that made these mansions possible began collapsing before anyone noticed. The federal income tax arrived in 1913, initially modest but rising steadily. By the 1920s, top marginal rates exceeded 70%. The investment income that had seemed infinite was suddenly subject to substantial taxation. Families who had never thought about income now had to calculate it carefully. Every dollar spent on mansion maintenance was a dollar that had already been taxed heavily. The servant economy was changing simultaneously. Workers who had once accepted low wages for the privilege of employment in great houses began demanding better compensation. Unions organized domestic workers in some cities. Immigration restrictions reduced the supply of cheap labor from Europe. The 50 servants who ran a mansion in 1895 might have cost $30,000 annually in total wages. By 1925, comparable staff cost 3 times as much. The expenses rose while the income fell. No one built these mansions expecting their families to become poor. The Vanderbilts, Astors, and Whitneys seemed wealthy beyond any possible exhaustion. Their fortunes were measured in tens of millions, when most Americans earned hundreds annually. The gap between their wealth and everyone else's was incomprehensible. How could families that rich ever run out of money? The answer was structural. They had built monuments that required their level of wealth to maintain. A $7 million palace needed a $70 million fortune behind it. When the fortune shrank through division and taxation, while the maintenance costs grew through inflation and rising wages, the arithmetic eventually failed. The mansions became traps, consuming more each year while the resources to feed them diminished. The families had built their own financial prisons and decorated them beautifully. The collapse began before the stock market crashed. The federal income tax, ratified in 1913, started modestly but grew steadily through the following decades. By 1918, the top marginal rate reached 77% on incomes above $1 million. The fortunes that had seemed infinite were suddenly subject to substantial annual deductions. Families that had never considered their income as distinct from their wealth discovered they were spending faster than they were earning. World War I accelerated the social transformation. Young men who had been groomed to inherit mansions went to France instead. Servants who had staffed great houses left for factory jobs that paid better and demanded less deference. The elaborate social rituals that had justified these palaces seemed frivolous during wartime. Maintaining a 70-room summer cottage while soldiers died in trenches became difficult to defend, even among the wealthy themselves. The 1920s brought false recovery, the stock market soared, and paper fortunes multiplied. Some families used the boom years to sell properties they could no longer justify maintaining. Alice Vanderbilt sold the massive Fifth Avenue mansion in 1926, unable to manage both it and the breakers simultaneously. The buyers demolished it almost immediately and constructed an apartment building on the site. Other families held on, believing the prosperity would last. They were wrong. October 1929 ended the illusion permanently. The stock market lost nearly 90% of its value between 1929 and 1932. Investment portfolios that had generated hundreds of thousands in annual dividends suddenly produced nothing. Families that had been spending income found themselves spending capital instead. The arithmetic that had seemed sustainable became catastrophic within months. The Depression destroyed what remained of the Gilded Age social structure. Visible wealth became dangerous rather than admirable. Families that had built mansions to prove their superiority now faced hostile public attention. The labor unrest of the 1930s targeted symbols of excess. Maintaining a palace while millions starved created political and personal risk. Many families shuttered their mansions simply to avoid becoming targets. The tax burden continued rising. By 1936, the top marginal rate reached 79%. Estate taxes approached 70% on the largest inheritances. Families that might have passed mansions to the next generation discovered that the taxes owed at death would consume most of the remaining fortune. The properties that had been built to establish dynasties became obstacles to passing anything useful to heirs. Cornelius Vanderbilt III watched his family's holdings disintegrate. He had been disinherited by his father decades earlier for marrying without permission, receiving only a fraction of what his siblings inherited. But even those siblings struggled to maintain what they had received. Alfred had died on the Lusitania in 1915. Reginald had drunk himself to death in 1925. Gertrude had her own fortune through marriage and her art career. Only Gladys remained to inherit the breakers, and she had no means to support it. Charles Schwab's story became a cautionary tale for the era. He had built the greatest private mansion in New York, 75 rooms on an entire city block. He had entertained lavishly and never locked his doors. But his investments collapsed with the steel industry. By the 1930s, he was effectively bankrupt, living in a small apartment while his empty palace awaited buyers who never came. He died in 1939 owing money to creditors. His widow tried for years to sell the mansion. No one would pay even the cost of annual taxes. It sat empty until 1948 when it was finally demolished. The widows bore the heaviest burdens. Men died and left their wives with properties they couldn't maintain and couldn't sell. Alice Vanderbilt struggled with the breakers for 35 years after Cornelius died. She wore black for the last 9 years of her life, mourning her youngest son Reginald while watching the fortune evaporate around her. She alternated years between Newport and New York because she couldn't afford to staff both houses simultaneously. When she died in 1934, her estate was valued at just over $10 million. Her father-in-law had been worth $200 million. 3 generations had consumed 95% of the fortune. The demolitions accelerated through the 1930s and 1940s. Families that had resisted selling during the 1920s gave up during the Depression. Properties that couldn't find buyers were sold for salvage value. Demolition contractors bid on the right to tear down mansions and sell the materials. Marble fireplaces brought a few $1,000s. Bronze fixtures were melted for scrap metal prices. Elaborate woodwork was stripped and sold by the panel. The buildings that cost millions to construct were worth more dead than alive. Newport's Bellevue Avenue became a row of missing teeth. Mansions that had housed the most prominent families in America stood empty with broken windows. Others were demolished entirely, their lots returning to grass. The summer colony that had defined American aristocracy was dissolving visibly. Families who had summered there for generations simply stopped coming. The parties ended. The orchestras fell silent. The elaborate rituals of calling cards and formal invitations became relics of a vanished world. The question that haunted every mansion owner was simple and devastating. What do you do with a property that costs more to maintain than you can afford, but cannot be sold at any price? Demolition meant destroying your family's legacy, erasing the physical proof that your ancestors had mattered. Keeping the property meant financial ruin, watching the maintenance consume whatever remained of the fortune. There was no good answer. The houses had become traps with no exit. Some families found creative solutions that delayed the inevitable. They rented rooms. They opened gardens for charity events. They sold off artwork and furniture to fund another year of maintenance. They closed entire wings and heated only the rooms they actually used. Each compromise diminished the property while extending its existence slightly. The mansions that had been built to demonstrate unlimited wealth now testified to its absence. By 1945, the destruction was largely complete on Fifth Avenue. The Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Whitneys, and most of the other great families had surrendered their Manhattan properties. The street that had been Millionaire's Row was transforming into a commercial corridor. Apartment buildings and office towers rose where palaces had stood. The concentration of private wealth that had defined the neighborhood for 60 years had dispersed entirely. Newport survived better than Manhattan because its properties were smaller and the location retained some appeal. But survival didn't mean prosperity. The families who kept their cottages did so through struggle and sacrifice. They cut staff to the minimum. They delayed repairs until emergencies forced action. They watched their neighbors' properties fall to wrecking balls and wondered when their turn would come. The golden era was over. What remained was Salvage. The Breakers still stands on its cliff overlooking the Atlantic. Over 400,000 visitors tour it annually, paying admission to walk through rooms that were designed for invited guests only. The palace that nearly bankrupted 3 generations of Vanderbilts now generates enough revenue to maintain itself and support other preservation efforts. The solution that saved it was simple and paradoxical. The family gave it away. Countess Gladys Vanderbilt Szechenyi inherited the Breakers when her mother Alice died in 1934. She was 47 years old, married to a Hungarian nobleman, and completely unable to afford what she had received. The taxes alone were $83,000 annually. Insurance, maintenance, and minimal staffing added tens of thousands more. Gladys had no income capable of meeting these demands. The fortune that built this palace had been divided among too many heirs and depleted by decades of struggle. For 14 years, Gladys wrestled with impossible arithmetic. She opened the house for abbreviated summer seasons with minimal staff. She closed entire floors to reduce heating costs. She watched the property deteriorate in ways that would have horrified her grandfather. From 1939 to 1942, she didn't occupy it at all, staying at her sister Gertrude's Newport home while the Breakers sat empty. The war provided temporary purpose when the mansion served as an air raid shelter. That usefulness ended with peace. The Preservation Society of Newport County offered a solution in 1948. Lease the property for $1 annually. Open it to the public as a museum. The society would handle all maintenance, all operating costs, all public tours. Gladys would retain ownership and maintain a private apartment on the 3rd floor. The mansion would survive without destroying her financially. She accepted. That summer, paying visitors walked through the Great Hall for the first time. The irony was immediate and profound. The palace, constructed to prove Vanderbilt's supremacy, survived by becoming democratic. Anyone with an admission ticket could see rooms once reserved for society's elite. The exclusivity that justified the building campaign was inverted completely. The mansion became famous because everyone could visit, not because access was restricted. The more public it became, the better preserved it remained. Biltmore Estate found a different path to the same destination. George Vanderbilt's widow, Edith, had struggled with the property after his death in 1914, but careful management kept it solvent. Their daughter Cornelia eventually passed control to her sons. The family decided to open Biltmore to paying visitors in 1930, making it one of America's first house museums at this scale. They retained ownership but transformed the business model entirely. Today, over 1 million visitors tour Biltmore annually. The estate that George couldn't make profitable as a private home thrives as a commercial operation. The pattern repeated across surviving mansions. The Elms opened to the public in 1962. Marble House followed in 1963. Rosecliff opened in 1971. Each property that survived did so by ceasing to be private. The families who built them couldn't maintain them. The public who visits them can. Some mansions found institutional rather than tourist salvation. The Frick Collection opened as a public museum in 1935, 2 years after Henry Clay Frick's widow died. The mansion became a gallery, where visitors see both the art and the domestic context that framed it. Other properties became schools or hospitals or government buildings. Properties that couldn't attract tourists or institutions faced demolition or abandonment. The Preservation Society now operates 11 historic properties, including the Breakers. Admission revenue from that single mansion supports conservation across all properties. The palace that cost $7 million and threatened to consume the Vanderbilt fortune now funds an entire architectural heritage. The numbers that once meant disaster now mean sustainability. Statistics tell the survival story clearly. Newport's summer colony once contained over 80 major cottages. Roughly half were demolished between 1920 and 1970. Most survivors open to the public. Properties that remained private either had unusual financial backing or generated income through conversion. Pure private luxury at Gilded Age scale proved unsustainable almost everywhere. Fifth Avenue's Mansion District disappeared nearly entirely. The Frick Collection survives as a museum. A few properties found institutional uses. Everything else was demolished and replaced. Apartments and offices now house thousands where dozens once lived. The concentration of private wealth that defined the neighborhood yielded to commercial density. The lessons discomfort anyone who builds monuments to personal importance. The Vanderbilts spent $7 million proving supremacy. Within 40 years, they couldn't maintain what they built. The Astors, Whitneys, and Schwabs faced identical fates. Fortunes that seemed infinite proved temporary. Mansions that seemed permanent proved unsustainable. The only structures that survived were ones their owners surrendered. Sharing saves what hoarding destroys. That is the blunt conclusion of a century of mansion history. Families who clung to private ownership watched wrecking balls demolish their heritage. Families who opened their homes to the public saw them preserved for generations. The exclusivity that justified original construction became the obstacle to survival. Democracy that builders would have despised became the preservation mechanism. The Breakers stands today exactly as Cornelius Vanderbilt intended 130 years ago. Waves crash on rocks below. The limestone facade gleams. The great hall soars to its painted sky. The platinum walls still reflect light that once illuminated society parties. Everything physical is preserved. But meaning has transformed completely. The palace built to prove one family's supremacy now proves something else. It proves monuments outlive builders only when purpose expands beyond private display. It proves beauty survives when it becomes accessible. It proves the greatest Gilded Age achievements could only be saved by abandoning the philosophy that created them. The Vanderbilts spent fortunes establishing their place in American aristocracy. Their descendants spent decades trying to maintain what those fortunes built. The only way to preserve the legacy was giving it to everyone. The most exclusive address in Newport became the most visited. The palace designed for the few belongs now to the many. That wasn't Cornelius Vanderbilt's intention when he commissioned Richard Morris Hunt in 1893. It was the only outcome that let his vision survive. The question lingers over every preserved mansion and demolished ruin. What does it mean that $7 million couldn't buy forever? What does it say about wealth and permanence that America's richest families couldn't maintain what they built? The Gilded Age aristocracy discovered a truth their monuments now teach every visitor. You can build for eternity with platinum and marble and gold, but you cannot make wealth last forever. When the money runs out, the only salvation is letting go completely.